All right, folks, what we're going to do for this one is talk a little bit about representation and how we end up with the elected officials that we get, what sort of job it is that they are doing. We'll start out just getting an idea of the elected representation that we have in Texas. I'm not going to get down to the state level offices because there's just too many of them. But to start to just give you an idea and maybe let you start wrapping your head around kind of the nature of representation, I want to give you a look at your representatives who work in Washington, D.C. So those are your elected officials from Texas, your representatives, and your two senators who represent the state or your district up in Washington these days. And you can kind of see the list here. We have two senators, Cornyn and Cruz. Cornyn is up for re-election this year. Ted Cruz just won re-election last year. And then the districts that most of you all would probably fall into if you live in the vicinity of Collin College. This covers most of your DFW, Collin County for sure, representatives. So District 3 is probably the majority of you all. That's the Collin County suburbs. Plano, Allen, McKinney generally will have be falling into District 3. And that's Van Taylor. He just recently was elected. So our previous person was Sam Johnson, who just retired from a long career in Washington, and Van Taylor was a state official who moved up. So District 3, currently Van Taylor. If you're out more to the northeast or out towards Rockwall, it's the elected official is John Ratcliffe, although he is in process of leaving that seat to go work in the Trump administration. If you're southeast, it's Lance Gooden. If you're kind of the Hearst, Euless, Bedford area, it's Kenny Marchant. If you're out towards Denton, it's Michael Burgess. South Dallas is Eddie Johnson. North Dallas, Park Cities, North Dallas. We can look at a map here in a minute. Is Colin Allred, and then if you're Arlington, West Dallas, moving into Fort Worth, going through Arlington, that would be Mark Vesey. So a few things maybe start to stand out as you start looking at these folks. The first might be, you've got John and Ted and Van and John and Lance and Kenny and Michael and Colin and Mark. Of these folks who are representing Texas from the Dallas area or statewide, you do have a majority of them are men. You start maybe looking at the dates. So the dates on there, the year of birth. So 1972, 65, 82, 51, 50, 35. 1983 is the youngest person on there, and 83 is going to be 36 going on 37. So most of these folks tend to be older. So lots of guys, lots of older. And I can, let's bounce over here. That's not going to work, but I've got it open. So these are your actual representatives from here in the state of Texas. 36 representatives that we have. This is going to be statewide. These are representatives up to Washington. The color, the little flag, 1st District, 2nd District, 3rd District. So Gohmert, Crenshaw, Taylor, Ratcliffe are all Republicans. They are the red. Van Taylor, by the way, that's our Collin County person, is there for District 3. And as you start going through, you're going to find a handful of Democrats as well. So Lizzie Fletcher in the 7th District is going to be the first Democrat. So as you're kind of scrolling through, or as I'm scrolling through, and you're kind of taking a look, some things perhaps start to stand out. The first of which is you're going to have most of your Republicans tend to be the older guys. Crenshaw so far is the youngest that you've seen of the Republicans. You're going to have I don't want to say young on the Democratic side, because certainly not. But they do tend to be a little bit younger than some of the Republicans will tend to be. You're also going to start to see or perhaps notice that most of your people of color, Hispanic folks, African Americans in Texas tend to fall into the Democratic side rather than the Republican side. And that is not a figment of your imagination. Going back over here. Whether that matters to us is up for debate, right? So, when we talk about issues of representation, we often talk about descriptive representation. So, we start to ask the question, and you're going to have a discussion board on Canvas asking for your opinions and thoughts and having you respond to the thoughts of others. But we ask this question when we talk about political representation is can a representative represent somebody who did not vote for them? Should we expect a representative that we did not vote for, that we do not like, to still speak to our interest? And maybe a different way to ask that is can we trust a representative to be able to speak for other groups, to be able to understand the interest of other groups? Can we trust a man to speak on behalf of a woman? Can we expect a female representative to speak on behalf of a male constituent? Can we expect a white guy to be able to speak on behalf of non-white populations or vice versa? Can we trust a wealthy college law school graduate to be able to speak to the high school dropout who's struggling to make rent? These are questions that don't have a definitive answer, right? Like these are things that we have to struggle with. And as we start to break down, we can start to get an idea. This is gives you a rough idea of how our state legislature looks in comparison to the actual population of Texas. So when we start with things like education level, what you're going to find is the outer ring of the three rings is the state, and then the Texas House and then the Texas Senate gives you an idea. So in Texas, we have 19% of our population, give or take. That changes a little bit year to year, but about 19% of our population who does not have a high school diploma. We don't have a single elected representative who failed to finish high school. Now, the first response to that is good, right? Like we expect our representatives to be well educated, and they do tend to be. So you can get the percentages there. Majority of our elected officials, House and Senate, are going to have some sort of at least a bachelor's degree. In the Senate, it's much more likely that they're going to have a graduate degree, which is probably an MBA, a business degree, or a law degree. So we expect our elected officials to have that level of education. But again, that's going to give them a different perspective on the world. We are expecting in the Senate a bunch of law school graduates to be representatives of a majority of the Texas population that never completed a degree, not an associate's, not a bachelor's. They're high school graduates or less. It's going to be what 19 plus 48. That's 67%. That's two-thirds of the Texas population. So education is not necessarily a difficult one. We tend to like more education. Gender is going to start to throw a little bit of a kink in things. So the gender breakdown in the mass public, right, is 50-50. It's usually a touch higher for women than it is for men, but we even that out broadly to about 50-50. But once you get into the Texas House and the Texas Senate, it is overwhelmingly male. So we're trusting these guys to be able to go and represent and adequately understand what it is that women are going through. We can say the same thing down here with occupation. So it's a full third of the Texas House are business people. They get into politics at the end or during their business career. In the Texas Senate, it's more than a third are attorneys. What you don't find in the House and the Senate are college students. You don't find restaurant workers. You don't find school teachers. You don't find social workers. You don't find nurses. You get very few of those voices. There's no car mechanics in the Texas legislature, but there are a fair number of auto dealers, dealership owners. So how well are they reflecting the interest of kind of the average person within their district becomes the concern. Last one up here, race. This gives you the racial breakdown of white, black, Hispanic, and Asian in the Texas population as a whole. And then relative to the House and the Senate, and what you find is that the Texas political establishment is disproportionately white, about two-thirds white in the Texas House, a little over that in the Texas Senate, even though the population at large is we're a majority minority. So white folks were the plurality, but not an outright majority as the Hispanic and Latino population continues to boom, and they tend to be, as with Asian Americans, as with African Americans, disproportionately underrepresented. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what that actually looks like in the state. Things are changing a little bit over time. So this is the most recent elections, which would have been the 2018 elections. There were 27 new representatives who were elected in Texas. 17 of them were Democrats, 10 of them were Republicans, and this gives you an idea of what those folks look like. So you're going to find, again, that same diversity mismatch that we were finding before is continuing on these newly elected officials. Our Republicans are predominantly white guys. There's one woman who was a newly elected Republican official. On the Democratic side, you've got a great deal more diversity. Certainly, there are some white guys in that mix, but lots of women, lots of people of color. Among the Senate, a similar deal, fewer of them there to try to draw any conclusions from. Women. So in the House of Representatives, Texas House, there's only 33 women currently, and that's sitting today, 114 men, 33 women. And you can get the idea there of among the women, the majority of them, a significant majority of them are Democrats. Here in the Senate, 9 women, 3 Democrats, 6 Republicans. So Republicans have a greater amount of representation of women in the Senate, but again, 9 women out of the 31 in the Senate is far from the 50-50 balance. So here's people of color in the 86th legislature. So Democrats are 80% people of color. Republicans are only 4% people of color. So that gives you the demographic breakdown I mentioned before. Republicans have become predominantly the party of white folks, and the Democrats are the party of everybody else in Texas, and this bears that out. 96% of the Republicans identify themselves as white, and only 4% would identify themselves as a person of color. Age breakdown, much tends to be fairly old. So you're going to find outright majority of the legislature is 50 years old or older. Education, here's the breakdown under the current legislature. And again, you're going to find that the legislature is significantly overeducated. Religion, you're going to find, again, this is going to be the breakdown. Here's some of the division between Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats tend to identify fairly strongly. You have a lot of people who identify as Catholic. You're probably seeing a lot of the Hispanic and Latino influence there. Among Republicans, you're going to see a greater propensity of finding Protestant, evangelical Protestant identifications there. So this is what our legislature is looking like these days. Um, with that idea of descriptive representation, what we're really asking is that acceptable? Can we trust these representatives to set aside their own personal backgrounds and biases and represent folks who are unlike themselves? And that's a question of how much do we trust the empathy of those elected officials. It's not a question that we have an easy answer on, and it's also why I tend not to like to lecture on this as though I have answers, because I don't. What we generally do when we talk about descriptive representation is let students talk it out. That makes a lot more sense to me. What we can talk about in terms of the political implications is different ways that we can understand representation. So, when we talk about representation in political science, we're usually talking about different understandings of how representatives might behave. So, we tend to think, like the popular understanding of representatives is that they will behave as delegates, that they will reflect the will of the citizens. They're going to be in touch with the people back home who live in their communities. That's the whole idea, right? Of having the amateur or non-professional legislature in Texas is these folks need to go back home and work and be in touch with the pulse of their local communities so that they can then go and best represent the interest of those communities when they go into office. And that's the idea of a delegate representative, that they are going to understand what it is that the people want. And regardless of their own personal opinions and beliefs, they're going to reflect the will of their representative or their constituents back home. We like the idea of delegate representatives, but at the same time, it's arguably a little bit naive. We certainly fall into the trap of politicians can vote for things for partisan reasons. They can vote for things for their own personal reasons that might not be all that popular with folks back home. Sometimes the folks are paying attention and that causes them all sorts of problems. Sometimes the folks, aren't paying attention, but when we ask them about it, it turns out that lo and behold, they disagree with whatever it was that the politicians were doing. Generally speaking, politicians are not all that popular. They would, we imagine, be much more popular if they always did whatever it was that the people wanted them to do. So generally, we talk about politicians tend to behave a little bit more as perhaps trustees. And here's the idea that we go out and we elect officials, not because they will always listen to us, but because we don't want to be paying attention to all of these different issues and problems as they occur. Instead, we want to find somebody that we trust to make good decisions and look out for our general interest, and we will send them off and let them be a trustee. They can act on their best judgment for what they think is the most appropriate behavior to take. And there again, perhaps we disagree, but with the trustee idea of representation, it doesn't really matter whether we agree or not. We pick our politicians because, assumedly, they are the best, the brightest, the most capable, well meaning, knowledgeable folks. And we are entrusting them with making those decisions. If you're looking for the middle ground, it's usually the Politico model, and this is probably the most accurate representation of folks. The vast majority of the time, people aren't paying attention. People don't necessarily know the ins and outs of a particular policy. And in those cases, politicians do need to be trustees. They need to evaluate the evidence and use their best judgment to figure out what it is that is going to be the most appropriate action to take. And then there's going to be those situations where their constituents have strong opinions, where public opinion is well defined. And maybe in those cases, because they are politicians and they want to get reelected and they want to remain, popular, are going to do whatever it is that the people want. Which people is it going to be community at large? Is it just going to be the folks that are likely to show up and vote for them? Is debatable. But the idea of politicos is, as representatives, they're going to do what the people want when the people are paying attention, and when the people aren't paying much attention, they're going to do what they see as the best option. The last one up there that you can see on the screen is the conscience model of representation. And this is fairly rare. This is the idea, it's kind of a trusteeship idea, but it's a moral trusteeship. So they're going to do what's right, even if it might not be popular. Um, I don't have great examples of this to give to you, but it's a model that gets pointed to sometimes. The best example I can really give you, before same sex marriage was extended nationwide, the state of New York debated it a lot. And the House of Representatives in the state of New York and the governor were both for it, and they kept passing year after year after year. They'd pass a same sex marriage recognition bill. And every year it would go to the Senate and lose, because the Senate in New York was, and still is, tends to be more conservative. So what happened is supporters of same-sex marriage decided to adopt a new approach. So they had tried and failed, tried and failed, tried and failed to get this bill through. So they changed strategy. The House passes it. It's going to go to the Senate. The governor is supporting it. It's going to go to the Senate. They presume the Senate's going to vote it down again, just like they have, year after year after year. So what supporters did was they found same-sex couples, men and women who were in long-term relationships, and they started a office visit campaign. So folks would go and visit the offices of these senators and tell their story. And arguably the most effective stories were those where one partner or another had medical issues or something along those lines. And the argument that they were making was, this person is my partner. I am their family, and I'm not allowed to go visit them in the hospital outside of visiting hours. I can't go and do that. If we want to split property, we don't have a legal way to make that happen, the equivalent of a marriage contract for opposite sex couples. And they were able to tell the stories and generate some sympathy, some empathy from those senators. And a handful of those senators came out and said, I could not look this couple in the eye across my desk. I could not look them in the eye and tell them that they couldn't visit each other in the hospital, that they couldn't have these same privileges and benefits because they are in a long-term loving relationship. And enough of those senators changed their vote. And they would go on record saying, I don't support same-sex marriage. I don't think my constituents back home support same-sex marriage, but I have to do what is right because my conscience tells me I have to. So rare that that's going to happen, but occasionally it can pop up. So delegates, trustees, kind of our ideal types on the extremes. Politico is the model that kind of bridges that gap, and it's probably your best description of how representatives work. So if we're going to trust representatives to use their best judgment a good portion of the time, who those folks are, what their backgrounds are, what their experiences we would expect would tend to matter, are going to affect the way that they see the world. Last point, we've talked about districting and gerrymandering before, but how we go about electing these folks matters. So if it's set up where we have a majority of Texans are people of color, non-white, how is it that we have an overwhelming majority of our political establishment are white folks? If we have a 50-50 split between men and women, why don't we have more women in office. And there's a various number of controversies that exist in terms of how we vote and how we run things. We talked before that turnout in Texas is poor. We're lucky to get decent turnout. This gives you an idea of what turnout looks like. Um, Collin County has uh, just under 550,000 registered voters. We have around 700,000 estimated total adult population, which means that we're actually doing pretty well. We've got 75 to 80% of our people in Collin County are registered uh, to vote. So that's pretty decent voter registration as far as Texas is concerned. We're a relatively wealthy county. We're a relatively well educated county. When I say relatively, I mean for Texas, we're very well educated and very wealthy. Both of those things correlate pretty highly with being more likely to vote. That being said, the 2016 presidential election, that's going to be a high turnout situation, right? Because we're voting for president. In Collin County, we had 68% turnout. Decent, but that's a whole bunch of people who are registered to vote who did not show up to vote. Local and county elections gives you a little bit of an idea here. In 2017, it was 11% turnout. For the 2013 general elections, we had a 7% turnout, and that was a high turnout at that point in time. Plano in 2013 nearly set a record. It's a record in modern history with 13% turnout for that local election. But it turns out those 18,600 ballots that were submitted that year, a significant number of them were turned in blank, with the exception of that was the year that they got to vote on legalizing liquor sales within the city limits of Plano. So what gets us out to vote is not having to drive to Dallas to buy a bottle of liquor. But while we're there, we're probably also not going to vote for mayor or city council. We're just voting for the one thing that's on the ballot. So our turnout is relative, is really low, amongst the lowest in the nation, as we've talked about before. Which means who is actually doing the voting matters quite a bit, because we've made it harder for some people to vote. And that kind of ties back into our traditionalism and our history. So we had, at various points in time, one of the most restrictive and discriminatory voting systems in the country. We were one of the last to get rid of whites only primaries. So who's allowed to vote in the primary elections? Up until the 1940s, we were whites only. So African Americans could vote in Texas, but they had to vote for whoever was pre-approved by the white folks. We held on to poll taxes 2 years, even after they were declared unconstitutional, so forcing people to pay to be able to vote, which was a barrier for those without many resources. We had property requirements. You had to own property in Texas to be able to vote in Texas, and in various elections up until the 70s. And it took us 10 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act nationwide to be considered in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And we mentioned with districting, we managed to find racial bias fairly frequently whenever we do redistricting. We go to court for that a lot. Kind of on the more recent side of things, we've had a lot of discussion the last handful of years on voter ID laws. This is kind of our latest battleground on issues of who's allowed to vote and when can they vote. So what sort of identification do you have to have in order to vote? Currently, you do need to have a state-issued photo ID. That could be a driver's license, a state ID card. It could be a government-issued passport. It could be a concealed carry permit. What it cannot be is your college ID. That doesn't count. So it's not considered to be state issue. So what ID counts, what ID doesn't count comes up a fair amount. And then Texas, to be in compliance with the federal law, does have to allow for people to, if they left their ID at home, to be able to some other way prove themselves to be who they say they are, and then provide proper ID later on. So this is where if your ID is lost, you can grab a bill with your name and address on it and use that as temporary identification for you. So voter ID laws, complaints vary about voter ID laws. It's most people do have an ID, that kind of goes without saying, but there are a significant number of people who don't have an ID, and there can be significant barriers to receiving an ID, right? It does cost some money. It does require time. You do have to go, if you don't have one to renew, you do have to show up at a DPS office and you have to go through the process, and you have to have all your other documentation. You have to have your birth certificate. You have to have another form of ID to prove that you are who you say you are, to get your state issued ID from the state of Texas. And you can start to imagine situations, right? So if you have a house fire and everything is lost, to be able to find the proper documentation to get back, to be being fully documented is going to be difficult. That becomes one of the big barriers with like folks who have had stints with homelessness or things like that, is they don't have access to the driver's license, to the birth certificate, things like that. There's really two categories of folks who kind of fall into that. It tends to be poorer people who live in cities, may take public transportation for most things, and then especially older folks, perhaps who have reached the point where they're not being permitted to drive anymore, will have an identification that expires and lapses, and they just never get it renewed. So there are a couple of categories of folks who are much less likely to have ID. Supporters of voter ID laws say that it's necessary to prove that we are who we say we are. Opponents are going to say that it's really rare that we're going to find violations that would be picked up on voter ID laws. The Austin American-Statesman did a study back in 2012 where they went through a 10-year period, 2002 to 2012. They found 57 prosecutions, charges filed for election fraud. Of those, only about half of them actually resulted in a conviction. And that could be all sorts of election fraud. Actually the most common form of election fraud, honestly, it tends to be younger people, college kids. If you've moved, which younger people tend to move a lot more, and you haven't kept up to date with each move and updating your new address and updating your driver's license, if you're voting at an address that you're not actually living in, that is probably the most common form of voter fraud that goes on anywhere in the country. And it's relatively innocent in terms of it's not the first thing on your mind whenever you move is to update your voter registration, but it is technically illegal. You're voting in the wrong spot. Pro tip, it's not something that's ever going to be prosecuted really, but it is something to keep in mind. Add it to your list of things to do whenever you don't move next time around. Or if you've recently moved and didn't make the updates. Last thing to throw out there, just as consideration, we often talk about how much money goes into politics. I'm just going to let you have this. This is from the 2002 elections. The money has only gone up since. So this is how much money got spent, how much money was raised, and how much money it takes to run for political office in the state of Texas. So if you're considering who are politicians paying attention to, when we say that lobbyists and the influence of money is significant, it's because to run for governor and win, you need, $20+ million, and you've got to be able to raise that. from folks, voters and non-voters alike. It's Texas, so we don't really have much in the way of restrictions, but politicians can bring in money and unlimited amounts for state office, from people in state, from people out of state. They can take contributions from businesses and interest groups, is permitted within the state as well. So when you're looking at needing to raise millions of dollars every 4 years, or if you're in the state House of Representatives, that's you're needing to raise, well, that 24 million is for the entire state House of Representatives. Um, but that's, you still need to raise, hundreds of thousands of dollars, oftentimes, to be competitive. So, lots of different issues that run around in Texas in terms of controversies with our voting system. But all of that really comes back to our ideas of representation, and who is it that's going to be put in that position to reflect the interest of the people when we make rules and laws and are working to use the levers of government to impact the social system. So I'm going to sign off there.